The unseen owner. The airport was bustling with people, each lost in their own world, hurrying to board their flights or say goodbye to loved ones. I had just passed through the security checkpoint, adjusting the sleeves of my tailored suit, when I felt it, that familiar, piercing gaze. It wasn't the casual glance of a fellow traveler or the routine observation of an airport staff member. No, this was something more intense, more deliberate. A white police officer stood near the check-in counter, watching me a little longer than necessary. His stance was rigid, his eyes filled with a quiet suspicion that I had encountered far too often. I had grown used to it over the years, the subtle yet undeniable scrutiny, the silent questions forming in the minds of people who saw my dark skin before they saw my success. I had learned to navigate these situations with a calm demeanor, but today, something felt different. I took a deep breath and adjusted the silver cufflinks on my wrist, a habit of mine whenever I needed to steady myself. The officer's gaze did not waver. If anything, it intensified, as if he was already building a case in his mind. The airport was filled with hundreds of travelers, yet I was the one who had caught his attention. I could feel it in the air, trouble was brewing. A familiar dance of prejudice. I walked forward, rolling my sleek black carry-on suitcase behind me, determined to ignore the stare. But even as I moved past him, I could feel his gaze following me, tracing my every step like a predator stalking its prey. I had seen this scenario play out before. The silent judgment, the assumptions, the eagerness to exercise authority, it was a cycle I knew too well. The officer finally made his move. With a sense of entitlement that was almost practiced, he strode toward me, his boots clicking sharply against the polished airport floor. His hand rested near his belt, close enough to his radio, perhaps even his handcuffs. "Sir," he called out in a tone that was anything but respectful. "Can I see your documents?" His voice was firm, unwavering, filled with the confidence of someone who expected immediate compliance. Around us, a few travelers paused, their curiosity piqued. I knew how this looked to them, a black man being stopped by a white officer in an airport. The script was familiar, predictable even. Wordlessly, I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out my passport and ticket, handing them to him without hesitation. I had nothing to hide. He snatched the documents from my hand with unnecessary force, flipping through them as though expecting to find something incriminating. His brow furrowed slightly as he read my name, Malcolm Bishop. He hesitated for the briefest moment before continuing his examination. "Where are you flying?" he asked, still staring at my passport. "Chicago," I answered, keeping my voice calm and even. "For what purpose?" His tone sharpened, his grip tightening around my passport. I met his gaze evenly. "Business." His eyes flickered up from the documents, studying my face. I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. A black man in an expensive suit, traveling for business? It didn't fit the narrative he had already constructed in his mind. He looked back down, flipping my passport to inspect it once more, as if searching for a flaw. "You travel often?" he asked, his suspicion deepening. "Very often," I replied. He was silent for a moment, the tension between us thick enough to cut. Then, without a word, he closed my passport and took a small step closer, breaching my personal space. "Come with me," he ordered. I didn't flinch, but inside, my blood ran hot. This was the moment. I could have resisted, demanded an explanation, but I knew how these situations worked. A public argument would only escalate things, and I had no interest in being tackled to the ground in front of a crowd of onlookers with smartphones. Instead, I simply exhaled and said, "May I ask why?" The officer's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching as if suppressing irritation. He wasn't used to being questioned. "Routine security check," he said curtly. "Step aside." Dragged into an unjust reality. I could feel the eyes of other travelers burning into me, their whispers just below the surface. Some looked away, unwilling to get involved. Others watched with quiet interest, waiting to see how things would unfold. I gave the officer a long, measured look before nodding. Of course. As he placed a firm grip on my arm and began leading me toward the security office, I let a small smile form on my lips. He had no idea who I was. I wasn't just another passenger. I owned the airline. A clash of power. The officer's grip on my arm was firm, his steps purposeful as he led me away from the main terminal and toward a more secluded area of the airport. The whispers of bystanders grew quieter the further we walked, though I could still feel their stares pressing against my back. I remained composed, walking with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. I could have easily ended this situation with a single phone call, but I chose not to, at least, not yet. I wanted to see how far this officer would go, how deep his prejudice ran before reality came crashing down on him. As we neared a restricted area, another officer, a woman with short blonde hair, took notice of us. She arched an eyebrow but said nothing, her gaze flickering between me and the man escorting me. She must have sensed something was off, maybe the way I carried myself, or the fact that I wasn't resisting like so many others before me. The officer holding my arm, whose name tag read Officer Daniels, ignored her. He was too focused on whatever narrative he had created in his mind. "Step in here," he ordered, leading me into a small interrogation room. The air inside was cold, sterile. A single metal chair sat in the center, facing a desk with a computer monitor. A camera in the corner blinked red, recording everything. I calmly took a seat, placing my hands on my lap. I had nothing to prove, and certainly nothing to fear. The unfounded interrogation. Daniels shut the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing through the tiny space. He leaned against the table, crossing his arms as he studied me. "Tell me again," he said, "where exactly are you headed?" I sighed, already growing tired of this game. "Chicago." "For business?" "Yes." "What kind of business?" I tilted my head slightly. "That's not relevant." His eyes narrowed. "It is if I say it is." I held his gaze, unwavering. "No, it's not." The muscle in his jaw twitched. He wasn't expecting me to push back, but I could tell he enjoyed this, the power trip, the unspoken threat that he controlled what happened next. "You been arrested before?" he asked suddenly. I let out a short, amused breath. "No." "You sure about that?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "Yes, officer. I'm sure." Daniels pulled out a notepad and scribbled something down, probably just for show. "Tell me, Mr. Bishop, how do you afford business class travel so often? You must have a pretty good job." I smiled. "You could say that." Daniels smirked, mistaking my calm for nervousness. He thought he had me cornered, that I was hiding something. "See," he continued, "guys like you, dressed in fancy suits, acting like they own the place. I've seen it before. Usually turns out there's something shady going on." I rested my elbows on the chair's armrests. "Guys like me?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The message was clear. I let the silence stretch between us before I finally spoke. "Let me save you some time, officer. I haven't committed a crime. I'm not a threat. You have my passport, my ticket, and no reason to detain me. So, unless you plan to arrest me, which would be a mistake, I'd suggest you let me go." Daniels didn't flinch. He stared at me for a long moment, as if debating his next move. Then, slowly, he stood up straight and exhaled. "You see," he said, "I don't like your attitude." I smirked. "And I don't like your bias." His face darkened. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. "I could hold you here for as long as I want," he said. "You could try," I countered. But it wouldn't end well for you. He scoffed. That right? And why is that? I leaned forward just slightly, my voice smooth, confident. Because, Officer Daniels, I own the airline. The realization hits. For the first time since this encounter began, I saw hesitation flicker across his face. It was brief, but it was there, the moment of doubt, the realization that something wasn't adding up. What? He said, almost as if he misheard me. I folded my arms. I own the airline. The one you just pulled me off a flight for. The one you assumed I had no right boarding. Daniels blinked. His mouth opened slightly before he snapped it shut. He looked down at my passport again, as if expecting it to change. That's a lie, he muttered. I chuckled. You really think I'd make something like that up? His hand twitched toward his radio, but he hesitated. I took out my phone, unlocked it with a tap, and pulled up a document. I turned the screen toward him. Read it, I said. Daniels hesitated before taking a step forward. His eyes scanned the screen, his face slowly losing its arrogant confidence. The document was an official business registration form with my name clearly listed as CEO of Bishop Airways. He swallowed. This doesn't prove anything, he mumbled, but his voice had lost its sharp edge. Oh, but it does, I said smoothly. It proves that you just detained the owner of the airline for no reason other than your own prejudices. It proves that you made a very big mistake. Daniel stepped back, clearly rattled. His hands clenched at his sides. This doesn't mean you're above the law, he said, but the authority in his voice had wavered. I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket. You're absolutely right. No one is above the law. But tell me something, officer, what law did I break? Silence. Daniel said nothing. Because he had nothing. The door suddenly opened, and the blonde officer from earlier stepped inside. Her eyes darted between me and Daniels before settling on him. What's going on here? She asked, her voice wary. Daniels clenched his jaw, his face pale. Nothing, he muttered. Just a misunderstanding. I gave a small smile. Oh, I'd say it was more than that. The blonde officer frowned but turned to me. Sir, you're free to go. I adjusted my cuffs and nodded. I know. Daniels didn't look at me as I picked up my passport and ticket from the desk. He knew he had lost. As I stepped past him, I paused just long enough to lower my voice and say, next time, officer, be careful who you judge. And with that, I walked out, leaving him with the weight of his own humiliation. The backlash begins. As I stepped out of the interrogation room and back into the main terminal, the tension in my shoulders eased slightly, but not entirely. The blonde officer, whose name I now noticed was Lieutenant Harper, followed a few steps behind, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mr. Bishop, she said, catching up beside me. I just want to apologize for what happened back there. I glanced at her. Are you apologizing on behalf of the airport, or on behalf of Officer Daniels? Her lips pressed into a thin line. I think you already know the answer. I nodded but said nothing. It wasn't my job to educate her on systemic bias or the consequences of unchecked authority. She was clearly aware that what had just happened was wrong, but whether she'd actually do anything about it was another question. I kept walking, adjusting my cuffs as I scanned the departure screens. My flight was still on schedule, Bishop Airways Flight 712 to Chicago, boarding gate C12. But my irritation remained. Not because of the delay, but because of the principle of it all. This was my airline. My flight. And yet, a power-drunk officer thought he could pull me aside like a common criminal just because he didn't like the way I looked. I wasn't about to let that slide. An unexpected audience. As I neared the boarding gate, a murmur spread through the crowd. Dozens of passengers who had witnessed my detainment were now whispering among themselves. A few had their phones raised. Someone had filmed the entire thing. A young woman with dark curly hair stepped forward, her phone still in her hand. "Excuse me, sir, but, was that really about nothing? That officer looked like he was harassing you." I studied her, noticing the worried glint in her eyes. She had seen everything. "You tell me," I replied. Her brows knitted together. "He was out of line. And you didn't even do anything." I exhaled slowly. "No, I didn't." Another voice chimed in, a middle-aged man in a blue business suit. "It's all over social media already. People are talking about it." He gestured to his phone screen, where a live video of my detainment was gaining traction on Twitter. I took a glance. Hashtag profiling at the airport was already trending. The attention was growing. And as much as I hadn't wanted this to turn into a public spectacle, I also knew that silence was never the right response to injustice. So I turned to the woman who had filmed it. "What's your name?" "Jasmine," she said. "Jasmine, send me the video." I gave her my business card. "I'll make sure it gets to the right people." She nodded eagerly. "Absolutely." As she sent the file to my email, I felt a shift in the energy around me. The situation was no longer just about me and Officer Daniels. It was becoming something bigger. A call from the top. Before I could even sit down in the lounge, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. "Malcolm Bishop." "Mr. Bishop, this is Edward Jennings, head of security for the airport." The voice was deep, professional, but also nervous. I wanted to personally extend my deepest apologies for the incident that just occurred. I smirked. "That was quick." "Ah, so you heard about it already?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yes, sir," Jennings admitted. "And I assure you, we are launching a full investigation into Officer Daniels' actions. This is not how we operate." I let out a slow breath. "With all due respect, Mr. Jennings, that's exactly how you operate. It happens all the time. The only difference today is that you targeted the wrong person." A pause. He wasn't expecting me to call him out so directly. "Mr. Bishop, I own the airline," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "Do you know what that means?" "It means I have the power to dictate whether my flights continue to operate out of this airport. It means I have a direct line to investors, to media outlets, and to legal teams. And right now, I have a choice to make. Do I let this slide with a half-hearted apology, or do I take action?" Jennings exhaled sharply. "Sir, please. I understand your frustration, but—" "No," I said. "You don't. But you're about to." I ended the call. I wasn't looking for apologies. I was looking for accountability. The consequences begin. By the time I boarded my flight, the video had already gone viral. News outlets had picked up the story. My assistant texted me updates. CNN, Black airline owner detained at his own airport in alleged racial profiling incident. NBC, CEO of Bishop Airways targeted in unjust airport stop, investigation underway. Asterisk Twitter explodes after businessman faces unjust detainment at airport. Jennings was about to have a very bad day. As I settled into my first-class seat, a flight attendant approached. She was nervous, holding a phone in her hands. "Sir," she whispered, "there's a call for you from someone high up in the airport administration. They want to speak with you before takeoff." I took the phone and brought it to my ear. "Mr. Bishop," a voice said, urgent and pleading. "This is David McAllister, the airport director. I am so sorry for what happened to you today. Please, let us fix this. We value your business, and we do not want this to escalate further." I leaned back, watching as the other first-class passengers took their seats. "It's already escalated," I said flatly. "Sir, we're willing to offer a public apology, an official statement condemning what happened. We're also reviewing Daniel's position at the airport. If there's anything else you need." I smiled, though it held no warmth. "Oh, I need something," I said. "And I suggest you listen carefully." McAllister went silent. "I don't want just an apology," I continued. "I want action. I want new policies in place. I want bias training for every officer working in this airport. I want Daniels suspended immediately. And I want to see real change, not just for me, but for every traveler who steps through your doors." Another pause. "Understood," McAllister finally said. "We'll make it happen." I handed the phone back to the flight attendant. As the plane took off toward Chicago, I gazed out the window, the city lights twinkling below. Daniels had assumed I was just another nameless passenger. But now, he, and the entire world, knew exactly who I was. And this was just the beginning. A reckoning begins. The hum of the airplane engines was a soothing contrast to the chaos I had left behind. As the city lights faded below me, I leaned back in my first-class seat, closing my eyes for a brief moment. The events of the last few hours replayed in my mind, not with anger, but with clarity. This wasn't just about me. It never had been. For years, people who looked like me had been subjected to the same unfair treatment, pulled aside for no reason, questioned like criminals, judged before a single word was spoken. The only difference this time? The target wasn't just a businessman. He was the owner. And now, the world knew it. The flight attendant returned with a tray of drinks, her hands shaking slightly as she approached my seat. "Mr. Bishop, can I get you anything?" I glanced at her name tag. Aisha. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with deep brown skin and a nervous energy that told me she had been following the news. "A glass of water is fine," I said. She set it down carefully, then hesitated. "Sir. I just want to say, what happened back there, it wasn't right." I looked at her, sensing that there was more she wanted to say. She bit her lip before continuing. "My brother. He had a situation like that before. He got stopped at an airport for no reason, missed his flight, lost a job opportunity because of it. But no one cared. No one listened." Her voice was soft, but there was emotion beneath it, a mix of frustration and exhaustion. I exhaled slowly. "They'll listen now." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time since this ordeal started, I saw something beyond the anger and injustice. Hope. She nodded, whispering, "Thank you," before walking away. The battle had only just begun. A call that changes everything. As soon as we landed in Chicago, my phone buzzed the moment I switched it off airplane mode. Over 100 missed calls. My assistant, my legal team, even some board members of Bishop Airways, all scrambling for answers. But one name stood out, Senator William Carter. I raised an eyebrow. Now that's interesting. Carter was a senior senator with influence in national aviation policies. If he was calling, this situation was bigger than I expected. I hit the callback button. "Malcolm," his deep voice answered almost immediately. "I've been trying to reach you." "I see that," I said dryly. "I take it you've seen the news?" Carter let out a low sigh. "You're making waves, Bishop. The Department of Transportation is getting involved. Hell, even the White House took notice." I sat up straighter. This was happening faster than I expected. "Let me guess," I said. "You're calling to tell me to let this go? To be reasonable?" Carter chuckled. "No, son. I'm calling to tell you to keep pushing. The time is right." I blinked, caught off guard. "Come again?" You've got momentum, Malcolm. More than just the media. Civil rights groups, business leaders, politicians, they're all watching how you handle this. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for change. I exhaled, gripping my phone a little tighter. He was right. This was bigger than me. Bigger than just one incident at an airport. What's the play here? I asked. Carter's voice turned serious. We need to push for a federal-level review of racial profiling in airport security. And we need your voice at the table. I glanced out of the car window as my driver pulled away from the airport. This was turning into something much bigger than I had anticipated. But I wasn't afraid. I was ready. A public reckoning for Officer Daniels. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Officer Daniels' world was crumbling. The viral video had reached millions. Public outrage was at an all-time high. News anchors were picking apart his actions frame by frame. And now, the airport administration was scrambling to control the damage. Inside an emergency meeting room, Daniels sat across from David McAllister, the airport director. His face was flushed, his confidence from earlier completely shattered. I was just doing my job, he insisted, gripping the table. McAllister's expression was unreadable as he slid a folder across the desk. No. You were abusing your authority. And now it's costing us. Daniels swallowed hard as he flipped open the file. A termination letter. His hands clenched into fists. This is bullshit. McAllister leaned forward, his voice cold. You profiled the wrong man, Daniels. A man who had the power to bring this airport to its knees. And now, you're a liability. Daniels' breathing quickened. He had never imagined that his routine abuse of power would actually cost him something. McAllister continued, his tone sharp. You'll be placed on immediate suspension, pending investigation. But let's be honest, your career is over. Daniels stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. This is because of the media, isn't it? If no one filmed it, I'd still have my job. McAllister narrowed his eyes. That's exactly the problem, Daniels. The only thing you regret is getting caught. Daniels stormed out, slamming the door behind him. His downfall had begun. The next move, a seat at the table. I arrived at my corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago, the media already waiting outside. As I stepped out of the car, microphones were shoved in my face. Mr. Bishop, do you have any comments on Officer Daniels' suspension? Will you be taking legal action against the airport? Do you believe this will lead to lasting policy changes? I raised a hand, silencing the crowd. Then, I spoke. This isn't just about me, I said. This is about every single person who has been unfairly judged, harassed, or detained because of the color of their skin. A hush fell over the crowd. Too many people suffer in silence because they don't have the resources to fight back. But I do. And I will. A few reporters scribbled notes frantically. Others lifted their cameras higher. So, no, I continued, my voice steady. I'm not letting this go. I'm pushing for real change. Not just at this airport, but in every airport across the country. A few reporters exchanged glances, realizing the significance of my words. I took a step closer to the cameras. And to those in power, I'm coming for your policies, your procedures, and your unchecked authority. I gave a small, knowing smile. Get ready. The cameras flashed. The microphones buzzed. And just like that, the fight had only just begun, the battle for justice. A national uprising begins. The morning after my press conference, I woke up to a flood of notifications. Emails, texts, missed calls, everyone wanted a statement, an interview, a comment. CNN, BBC, the New York Times, even the Washington Post. It wasn't just the airport anymore. It was a national conversation. I turned on the TV in my penthouse office. CNN breaking news: outrage continues after Bishop Airways CEO detained at his own airline's terminal. Civil rights leaders call for immediate policy changes in airport security. A panel of analysts debated the issue. Anchor: Malcolm Bishop has become the face of a larger problem. His experience isn't unique. What's unique is that this time, the victim had the power to fight back. Legal expert: this could set a legal precedent for racial profiling cases nationwide. If Bishop pushes forward with legal action, airports across the country could face lawsuits. Political analyst: the White House has been pressured to respond. The Department of Transportation has already scheduled a meeting to discuss new airport security policies. I sat back, absorbing it all. This wasn't just a social issue anymore, it was a political crisis. And I was right at the center of it. Daniels faces his karma. Meanwhile, in a rundown police precinct, Officer Daniels sat alone in an interrogation room, except this time, he wasn't the one in control. Across the table sat two FBI agents. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were sharp, taking in every nervous twitch Daniels made. The lead agent placed a manila folder in front of him. "We've received multiple complaints about your conduct over the years, Daniels," the agent said. "Excessive force, racial profiling, falsifying reports, sound familiar?" Daniels scoffed. "You're kidding, right?" The second agent leaned in. "Oh, we're not kidding. And now, thanks to that little stunt you pulled with Mr. Bishop, you're on our radar." Daniels swallowed hard. "You think I'm the only one who does this?" he snapped. "This is how we operate. I just got caught." The agent gave a cold smile. "Good. Then that means you'll have plenty to say when we start investigating the entire department." Daniel's face turned pale. "You have two choices," the lead agent continued. "You can cooperate and give us names, other officers who've been doing the same thing, or you can go down alone." Silence. Then, Daniel's fingers twitched. He clenched his jaw. "I need a lawyer." The agents exchanged a knowing glance. "Of course you do." Daniel's world was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A seat at the table. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a high-security boardroom in Washington, D.C. Across from me sat top executives from major airlines, members of the Department of Transportation, and representatives from the TSA. Senator Carter sat to my left, watching quietly. At the head of the table, a gray-haired man in a navy suit cleared his throat. James Whitaker, Secretary of Transportation. "Mr. Bishop," he began, folding his hands. "I want to start by personally apologizing for what happened to you." I stared at him. "With all due respect, I'm not here for an apology. I'm here for change." The room went silent. Whitaker exhaled. "Understood. What are you proposing?" I pulled out a stack of documents and slid them across the table. "These are the numbers," I said. "Airport profiling incidents. Detainments without cause. False arrests. You'll notice a pattern." The officials flipped through the pages, their faces darkening. I continued, my voice unwavering. "I'm not asking for a meaningless policy update that no one enforces. I'm demanding real accountability." Whitaker adjusted his tie. "And what does real accountability look like to you?" I leaned forward. "Mandatory body cameras for airport security officers. Immediate penalties for racial profiling. A federal oversight committee to review every case of unjustified detainment. And," I added, "I want Officer Daniels prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." A murmur spread across the room. A TSA official hesitated. This would require a complete overhaul of security training." I didn't blink. "Then overhaul it." The room fell silent again. Then, Whitaker nodded slowly. "I'll take this to the president," he said. I sat back. Good. The power shift. A week later, new policies were announced. The TSA implemented a nationwide review of its procedures. Officers were now required to log every detainment with a documented reason. A new hotline was established for passengers to report discrimination. Daniels was officially indicted on federal charges for civil rights violations. I stood in my Chicago office, watching the news. NBC headline: Bishop's fight for justice results in sweeping security reforms. I exhaled. It was a victory, but it was only the beginning. A soft knock on my door pulled me from my thoughts. "Come in," I said. My assistant stepped inside. "Sir, there's a call for you." "From the White House." I raised an eyebrow. "Put them through." As I lifted the phone to my ear, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was history in the making.